Melanin is a protein pigment produced by melanocytes in the epidermis of the skin. Melanin provides the brown or black color associated with skin, and the darker the skin is, the more melanin is produced. So one interesting fact is all people have the same relative number of melanocytes. It's just that people with darker skin have more active melanocytes that produce more melanin than people with lighter skin. UV radiation actually triggers or stimulates melanocytes to produce melanin, and that's because melanin protects the DNA of your skin cells from UV radiation. So when you're exposed to the UV radiation from the sun, your body responds by producing more melanin to provide you with more protection. That's why when you're sitting out in the sun or if you go to a tanning booth, you get a tan. That tan is just a darkening of the skin associated with more melanin production. Now, if you don't have enough protection or if you're exposed to too much UV radiation, it can damage the DNA in your skin cells and lead to skin cancer. Freckles and moles are just irregular accumulations of melanocytes. So if you have a mole, it just means that there are a lot of melanocytes in that area and they're actively producing melanin to produce that freckle or mole. Most freckles and moles are benign, meaning that they're harmless, but some may be cancerous. And we'll talk a little bit more about skin cancer in a different screencast. Now, sometimes the melanocytes don't work the way they should. So one type of skin pigmentation disorder is called albinism, or you might be more familiar with just the term albino. Albino is a genetic disorder in which the melanocytes lose the ability to produce melanin, and this happens in every single cell in the body. So someone who has the albinism genetic trait is going to have very, very pale skin, because they don't have the melanin to make it darker, and they tend to have very pale eyes or even red eyes. So you can see here in this picture, this is a African child who lacks the ability to make melanin. So he has very pale skin. You can see here, this is a rabbit, which is albino, and it has white fur because it's not able to make any melanin to make the fur change to a darker color. You'll also notice the red eyes, and that's because your eye color is also primarily determined by melanin, and with a lack of melanin, you end up having really light colored eyes or red eyes. Now, some of the problems associated with albinism is that people with this disorder, they're losing out on the protective function of melanin. Because remember, melanin is protecting your skin cells from damage that comes from UV radiation, which UV radiation comes from the sun. So you're exposed to it every time you walk outside. So people that have the albino trait, they tend to be very sensitive to sunlight. They burn really easily. They're more prone to skin damage associated with UV exposure. Now, another skin pigmentation disorder is called vitiligo, and this is it's similar to albinism in that some melanocytes lose the ability to make melanin, but it doesn't occur over the entire body. It just occurs in patches, and those patches lose their pigmentation. So you can see here, this would be a spot where the melanocytes are no longer able to make melanin. Same thing with these lighter colored areas. The cells, the melanocytes in these areas are unable to make melanin, and therefore the skin is lighter in those areas. They don't know exactly what causes vitiligo, but they think that it might be due to an autoimmune reaction. And autoimmune just means that perhaps your own immune system attacks your melanocytes in order to destroy their ability to make the melanin. Changes in your skin pigmentation can also be, it can also help to diagnose an illness or a disease or something that's going on deep in your body. So for example, jaundice happens when someone gets a yellow tinge to their skin and eyes. So it's pretty common in newborns because sometimes the liver is just not functioning at 100%, but it typically goes away within a couple days or a week in a newborn. But it can also happen in older people that are not newborns, and it's typically caused by the liver not functioning the way it should. And so one thing that the liver does is it produces something called bile, and it takes this yellow pigment and it kind of processes it and breaks it down. And typically this is the pigment that makes your poop kind of like brown or yellow. But if the liver isn't functioning properly, is not able to process this bilirubin and bile, and so it accumulates in the body's tissues, and it's got a yellow pigment to it. So you see that yellow. So yellow tinges to the skin and eyes may be a symptom that the liver is not functioning the way that it should. Cyanosis is another outward skin pigment change that can indicate that there's something else going on inside the body. So cyanosis usually results in a white or blue color, and it typically happens on the extremities, so such as the tips of the tips of the fingers, tips of the toes, and places like the lips. And what happens is if someone is not getting enough oxygen either in their body or to those areas, it makes the area turn really pale or even a bluish color. Because this pink color that you can see down here, this pink skin color is coming from the blood in the blood vessels in your skin. But the tips of the fingers here are not getting that same blood supply. And so something is restricting blood flow, and that red pigment of your blood is gone, and you're just seeing the white pigment of the skin itself. So this paleness, or it can even look blue, this means that either the person's not getting enough oxygen or the body part itself is not getting enough oxygen. So sometimes that happens when you're cold, or if you had like a tourniquet on a limb, then the part of the limb past the tourniquet would lose its color. It can also happen due to different types of diseases and disorders. So Raynaud's syndrome is probably what's going on in this picture here. People with this syndrome, at times, their extremities, especially their fingertips and toes, they just don't get as much blood supply as they should, and it causes the fingertips and the toes to take on that cyanotic type pigmentation. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes it just happens when it's cold or when the person is stressed, but it's not always it's not a constant thing. Now, if you have too much restriction of oxygen, so if you don't get enough oxygen to your body tissues, they can die. And so this also happens in frostbite. And so if it's really cold, your tissues aren't going to get the oxygen they need, and your fingers might fall off. So keep your hands warm. Another skin pigmentation change is erythema. And erythema is just any time the skin looks redder than it does normally. And typically that's because there's more blood flow to an area, or that blood is flowing to more superficial parts of the body. So for example, things like if you burn yourself, inflammation brings more blood to the area where it's damaged, and that blood brings with it a red color. And so that's why a burned area appears red. Things like emotions, so if someone is embarrassed or in love or angry, those emotions often show up as erythema in our face. So you can see here, it could be just because someone's cold, but it also could be because they're in love or they're embarrassed or something like that. When someone has a fever, the fever can also make the person appear to be flushed or kind of reddened. And then areas of inflammation. So anytime there's a burn or some other damage, more blood comes to the area to bring supplies to the area to help with healing. So it's bringing white blood cells and proteins and enzymes and nutrients to the area. And because you have more blood, you have more of that red pigmentation.